Okay, that's helpful, and we do like that. But now give me maybe realistic you, doomsday you. What do you fear may be the case?
I mean, I fear that journalists won't change enough.
If the trust is cracked, where do we stand? Who keeps score when the facts land? This is media in the margins. Media in the margins.
For transparency, this podcast approaches journalism as a public, evolving process rather than a finished product. We treat knowledge making as something that's developed through dialogue, not delivered as final authority. While we retain editorial control, our goal is to make parts of that process visible in its uncertainties, its limits, and its revisions over time. Corrections and updates will be documented in the show notes. For context, I'm currently affiliated with Oslo Met University in the Department of Photojournalism. This conversation is being recorded on April 8th, 2026. And with that, let's begin with the introduction. So, for this conversation, we'll be focusing on how trust in journalism is actually built or broken in practice. What does it really take to build or rebuild trust in media ecosystems? Now, that includes traditional newsrooms and independent creators, which will be our focus. And today we have a special guest, Mollie Muchna. Did I pronounce that correctly?
It's Muchna, but you pronounce it closer than a lot of people do.
It's Muchna.
Very phonetical, yes.
Okay, Mollie Muchna. All right, I want to get that right. Okay. Mollie Muchna is a project manager at Trusting News, where she works with journalists and newsrooms to develop practices that build trust through transparency, audience engagement, and clearer communication. With over a decade of experience in audience-focused journalism and teaching at the University of Arizona, her work centers on how journalists can make their processes visible and more understandable to the public. Is there something you would like to add?
No, that was a great introduction. Thank you.
Yay. You're welcome. I guess then we can roll into the lightning question. I have a couple for you. I'm curious where you trust to get your information and news right now.
That's funny. That's actually one of the questions I get the most from non-journalists in my life. Like I get that question so often from friends and family who are just like, well, you work in news and trust in news. Like, where should I go for information? And it depends and it differs on the topic. But there's a couple places that I like to get my news that I often recommend. One for more like national, international, and political news. There's two newsletters that I read. I think I am definitely a journalist who talks a lot about how I have had major burnout with the news and news fatigue. And so for me, having like a healthier news diet has been very important and not like I just would be one of those people who like gets sucked into a story and I can just doom scroll all day. And so having some like containers around the content that I'm reading has felt really important. And so there's one newsletter I really love called Tangled News, which is run by Isaac Saul. He is a reporter, and essentially it's a newsletter once a day on the weekdays that really deep dives one topic. And what I love about that is that it shares kind of like what people on the right are saying, what people on the left are saying, and then they have this interesting element to it where he usually shares his take, or as his team has grown, it's been other people on his team as well. And so I think there's just a unique element there of like sharing a little bit about what this journalist or the journalist who has deep dived and analyzed this story, kind of what their takeaway and their analysis of the whole story is. And they do such great transparency around their work. So that's one place. And another place I get political news is this newsletter by journalist Matt Kaiser. WTF just happened today. And it's again a once a day newsletter that just gives a quick synopsis. His whole mission is that he doom scrolls the news so that you don't have to. It does feel like a very helpful way. It's not breaking news. It's very much just like, here's what happened today. Here's a recap. He aggregates from a lot of trustworthy news sources. So those are two places I get national news. And then on a local level, I have, there's a couple really great independent startup newsrooms here and a couple newsletter products as well that I like to read in my local region of Southern Arizona as well.
Would you say then that most of your news that you get is text-based news?
I mean, it varies. I definitely get news from creators online. Like I love not Z, sorry. I love Sphere, who has Under the Desk News on TikTok, is a great kind of creator journalist, definitely from a specific point of view. And so I try to like make sure that if I'm, I'm watching and consuming news from sides across the political spectrum so that I have a wider understanding. But yeah, I definitely find myself getting a lot of news from creator journalists as well.
And if we're defining independent creator journalists, how would you define that?
I would say creative journalists, they combined traditional, like the elements of traditional journalism with the creation technique to produce news or information on more digital platforms. So, unlike traditional journalists who usually work for established news organizations, creative journalists often are independent or work as part of like alternative media outlets. And they often utilize other platforms like social media, YouTube, Substack to share their work with their audience.
Can you kind of explain for everyone what trusting news is and kind of what you're excited about working on specifically now?
Yeah, so Trusting News, we are an organization that helps journalists earn trust with their audience. So we do this both with traditional journalists, but as more and more people are consuming news from independent creator journalists, our focus has shifted there as well. And so we really do this by helping journalists understand their audience perceptions. So, like, what does their community need from the news? What do they think of the news? And then we try to help bridge that gap with research and strategies. We're very research backed. And so, with creators of that, like, our ultimate goal at Trusting News is to help people have access to good information and to know what good information is and be able to find that in their local community. And so our whole goal is to help journalists signal their credibility to their audience. Like, what can they do to make their processes, their ethics, their integrity, their goals, like what it is that makes them like what makes them worthy of people's time, attention, and trust, right? And so as we see again, like I said, more and more people shifting to get their news from creator journalists, the more we're shifting focus and attention there. I think, there's a lot that traditional journalists take for granted in terms of signaling their credibility. They feel like, they're part of this established name. And a lot of times they assume that gives them some credibility. And sometimes they're right. Like sometimes being a part of this larger news organization that carries a lot of weight, like the Washington Post or New York Times, like sometimes that can be a negative, but sometimes that can be a positive, right? Of like there's automatic credibility to that versus just somebody showing up on a vertical video on Instagram. It's a lot harder to stand out because anybody can be doing journalism on Instagram, right? So what makes your journalism different? What sets you apart? Like what are the ways you're working to be fair and accurate and fact check your information? Like how are you thoughtful about the sources? There's so many things that go into that just aren't apparent to audiences. So that's what we're hoping to do with creators is kind of help them coach them through understanding like what signals credibility to their audience and then how can they adopt that into their day-to-day content that they're producing.
So what does signal these authentic trust related relationships? What are some of the things that you're suggesting to incorporate into their kind of pipeline or workflow?
Well, like I mentioned, we're very research backed. So we have a sense of what would work well. We all come from traditional newsroom backgrounds, my whole team. And so, we have a sense of what would be good to share. And as news consumers, what we hear from audiences. But a lot of our research has been more looking at traditional news. And so that's where we see a big research gap. And we are looking to fill that and actively pursuing that right now to try to do some more sophisticated research around that to really understand what signals help the audience navigate the news and help the audience identify who is a credible creator. There is a lot of research that's been done by Pew and Knight and some other folks around what it is that people find trustworthy and like what it is that they want from news consumers. And one of the things that people always say in these questions of like, what do you value from your news provider or someone who's sharing the news is authenticity. But that's one that's kind of a question mark. Like, what does authenticity mean? We can extrapolate from that and assume that it's like the connection, the relationship, like sharing about who you are and some of that transparency that we so often preach at Trusting News. But we can't say for sure. So there is more research needed there. But I think there's also some things that we can say that are probably just best practice, like, talking about, what your process is for gathering information, right? Like there's just so many people sharing hot takes on social media. And so if you're somebody who's doing like thorough reporting, right? Like how can you make that clear? How can you make your sources clear? How can you make your processes clear? Like the ethics, how you're working to be fair. We did a small test this winter doing some coaching with a couple different types of creator journalists, and we had them test a few different strategies. And we didn't obviously have formal research attached to this, and so it's kind of just based on anecdotal research from us and the creators. But overall, we saw a positive response when creators inserted more. Like one creator talked, like attached their mission to their daily content. One got more clear about like what their purpose and role was, and like why it was that they started this project and why it is that they're operating, and like what their goals are with their project. Another person talked about, who they are and like what makes them credible in their background in journalism. So overall, we saw some positive response from the audience, but yeah, we're excited to hopefully dig into that more this summer.
And I did check out your website, of course, and I signed up for your newsletter. Um, and looked at you have a lot of free resources well, anyone could use them to their advantage, really, but I guess aimed towards journalists, whether legacy media or creators and newsrooms. Do you want to talk a little bit about the type of resources you have available?
Yeah, we have tons. Pretty much everything that we do is open source. We know oftentimes journalists and newsrooms don't have, I mean, it depends on the newsroom, but a lot of them don't have money to pay for this type of support. And so we are mostly grant funded so that we can offer that support for free to journalists in newsrooms and otherwise. And so, yeah, we have probably too many resources on our website. We probably the most helpful place to get started with resources are our trust kits that we have. They are basically self-guided toolkits that journalists can use to walk them through how to do certain elements of earning trust. So it's like talking about your coverage, explaining your finance and ownership, talking like how to help your audience become more news literate. And so those each are very like contained. They have the research, they have strategies, and then they have a lot of examples of how other journalists are doing this. But specific to the creator journalists, we have a couple resources. One, we have a kind of ethics checklist that we created with Liz Kelly Nelson and Project C, as well as the Lenfest Institute last fall. We created this whole toolkit around helping funders identify credible creators and kind of making the case for why funders are interested in, boosting up a local information ecosystem, like why it needs to include creator journalists. And so, but the big question that we often get from people is like, okay, well, how do you know if a creator is credible or if they have good ethics or if they're somebody that we should give financial supporting to? And so Lenfest helped host that project where we created lots of resources around that. But one of the resources, we were creating a checklist for funders in terms of, the things that they should be looking for from a creator, if that to like kind of see if they maybe are ethically aligned with their goals and values. But then we didn't want to just create something for funders and not create something for creators as well. It's like, okay, on the flip side, here are the ways that you can kind of signal that you have ethics and credibility. And so we created this kind of ethics guidelines. I wouldn't say it's like an actual code of ethics formally, but more just kind of some best practices for creators, which I think is a really helpful resource because it also includes examples of what that looks like. I was just at the Online News Association conference last week and talked to a lot of creators. And when I talked to really any journalist, whether they're independent or with a newsroom, like a lot of times they have just questions of what that actually looks like in the work. They're like, yeah, I love the idea of this. Like, I understand the concept, but like, what does that actually look like showing up in my vertical video or in my newsletter or in, my print story, whatever it might be. And so I think that creator checklist is a really helpful resource just in that it goes through really detailed of like both resources to help you do the thing, but then also examples of how other creators have done it. And then we often don't, like you mentioned, we mostly create resources for journalists, not aimed at the public. But we sometimes do help create resources that like journalists can share with the public because we really believe that like part of journalists' role is helping their audience navigate this very confusing, overwhelming information ecosystem. So we did create actually a checklist and some social cards that anyone could use that just kind of help they could share with their audience or on their platforms that are just kind of like a checklist of like, okay, is this person credible or not? Like, are they citing their sources? Do they talk about what their goals are? And so we have that free on our website as well.
That was my next question. I was
Okay.
curious if you were getting into, from the public side, any kind of ideas about how the journalist should kind of, because part of it, yeah, the journalist can be educated about ethics and about trust and authenticity, but then if the audience doesn't quite understand what makes a trustworthy journalist, then we've got a breakdown. So I was curious about
Yeah, I mean, I just think that we put a lot of responsibility on the audience. And what we're seeing is that more and more people are tuning out from the news, right? Like news avoidance goes up every year, news fatigue goes up every year. People are more and more overwhelmed, which just makes sense. Like we've never been in such a globalized information ecosystem with more and more voices being added every day and not all of them credible. So it's very confusing and it's a lot. And I think we can tend to be like, well, it's like I just remember working in daily newsrooms and people just being like, well, like I can't believe our audience doesn't know this, or like just kind of being like frustrated at the audience versus being seeing our role as really like we can help be educators and teachers, and what better way than in the content that we're sharing with people. Like what better way than in the story where somebody might have a question about, why it is that we interviewed this person or not this person, or what our policy is. We say like they didn't respond for comment, but what does that actually mean? How much time did you give them to respond? Like all these kind of basic things about journalism we can so easily explain to our audience, and we really have seen, at least in all of our research with in more traditional news organizations, that that really does help boost the public's perception of trust in that work. And so really just like trying to help journalists see their role, and like they can help their audience become more news literate without putting on like a news literacy course that only certain groups of the audience really care about that sort of stuff. Most people are just trying to like go about their day-to-day life, get information that they need. Most people aren't putting that much thought into their news diet. They might know that they feel overwhelmed or that it feels complicated to get information, but they're not necessarily thinking about, yeah, like making sure that they're crafting a thoughtful, well selected news diet. I mean, some folks are, but not everyone. And so, what is it that we can do in this day to day content? If they stumble upon something on Instagram, if they stumble upon something um, on Facebook, like what can we have in that content that, in plain language, not journalism jargon, like very clearly explains those basic principles of journalism and journalism ethics?
have you done any research, or even through the creators you've been talking to, have any idea about the platforms that most support this idea of trust and authenticity, or best practices for creator journalists?
Like tech platforms, you mean that? Like,
Yeah. Is that not part of the discussion that you're, I don't know.
no, no, that's a great question, and it absolutely is a part of the discussion at the industry, and I think it is a part of discussion in rooms with TikTok and those tech companies. And I know that they say that they really like want to boost. At least some of them have said they want to boost creators who are doing authentic work, but I think there's a big gap there, right? Like it would be really amazing if tech companies rewarded journalists who, and independent or otherwise, who prioritize transparency and accuracy and ethics and thoughtfulness. Like if there was a way that tech companies could adopt that and make that part of their sorting for the algorithm, I think that that would be wonderful. I don't know how much that's happening right now. And I'm not in those rooms enough to know how much that comes up in conversation there, but I do think it's definitely, people are having lots of conversations about it, and I know that there's definitely a big desire for that, but I'm not sure if that's changed. That was
What exactly are you spending time researching right now and finding with your own, perhaps, analytics on your side, from what journalists and independent or otherwise are looking for from your organization? And also perhaps what you're researching, your research questions in the next, so.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think when we look at creator journalism, again, we'd love to have a better sense and understanding of what sort of credibility signals resonate with audiences and different audiences and on different platforms, and yeah, what that looks like. I think it'll be really interesting to see if when folks are like hyper tuned into a product, if they're really bought into the product, that would probably change it versus if it was just somebody randomly finding a video that they've never seen this creator or journalist before. Like, what sort of things could that journalist say or include in their reporting or in that daily content that would really like show that they're doing this with ethics and care? And so that's a big question that we have in the creator realm. Again, because we are grant funded, really our goal right now is to just fundraise to be able to support that research and bring on a research partner. And we work with a great team of researchers at a few different universities, and so are always excited. So if there's folks who are interested in this and want to partner, we're always interested in chatting and collaborating. But our work, I mean, creator is such a sliver of the work that we're doing right now at Trusty News. We also have a big focus right now and a lot of research wrapping up actually right now this month around AI. We've been really investigating like AI with journalism, what it is that the public assumes about journalists' use of AI. Most of them assume journalists are using AI, whether they're not or not, whether they are or not, what it is that they want to see, what kind of transparency and like what sort of ethical best practices there are around AI disclosures. And
Wait a minute. 1 minute. 1 minute for I'm not hearing you.
Hey, this is a non-commercial commercial, and the only break I'm taking in this entire podcast to make one request. If you're enjoying this content, guess what? We're not getting paid for this at all. So it would really help us if you would share, subscribe, follow, like all of those fun things that take a couple seconds, a minute of your time, means so much to us, and technically doesn't cost a thing. So with that, back to the show. Thanks for listening. Oh, I almost forgot. I also would love you to comment. Let us know what we're getting right. Let us know what we're getting wrong and what you'd like to see more of.
I remember where I dropped off, but I was saying that the creator work is just our work with creator journalists is just a sliver of the work that we're doing right now. We're also doing work right now, wrapping up some research around AI and understanding audience perceptions around AI with journalism and kind of what they want to see, what kind of transparency and ethics around AI use they want to see from journalists. And really, we focus a lot on how journalists can disclose their use or non-use of AI to their audience. And through that research we've been doing the past few years, my colleague Lynn Walsh has been doing a lot of that. We really found that people really don't understand how AI works. Like, the public has a lot of questions. There's a lot of information gaps that exist there. And so what we heard from the people who participated in our research, and of thousands of people who we surveyed across the country, people said they would really welcome journalists like helping educate them about AI and how that operates. And so the current research cohort that we're running right now with journalists, it's actually with some newsrooms across the globe, but a lot US based, focus in on the AI literacy aspect. And so these journalists have been testing, sharing different AI literacy elements like vertical video and social cards with their audience. And again, we are kind of just wrapping up that research and analyzing it, but it should be released in June. So excited for that. And then we're also doing a lot of work around what we call like helping newsrooms tackle polarization and bias and how they can connect like democracy to their day-to-day work. So we are currently running a program. I think it is actually full right now, but my colleague Joy Mayer is running a program that was supported by the Knight Foundation to help coach newsrooms through some of that. So really thinking about like who it is that we're reaching, who it is that we're not reaching as a news organization. What about our internal culture and dialogue, and who's on our team? Like, who are we well informed about? Who might we be missing? And then kind of looking for gaps in that coverage. We hear from audiences all the time and all the research that we do that coverage feels biased or irrelevant based on a lot of the framing that journalists use. Like, even if it's factually correct, it might not be framed in a way that makes people feel seen and heard and understood.
You
Sorry,
have
it
an
cut out for
example?
me for just a second, but I think I'm back.
Okay. Are you there? Weird. Okay. This is too bad. Okay, I'm gonna wait. Let's just keep talking. Oh no, now you're frozen. I think you're gonna have to hop back off and on again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, I usually don't have problems with my computer freezing, so I'm not sure what's going on.
I think sometimes it's pretty taxing.
Yeah, we did a couple of research projects in, I want to say 2020 2021 or 2022. I'm forgetting the exact year with a few of our um, research partners, most notably Sue Robinson at the University of Wisconsin. But around like polarization. And so part of that was yeah, let me back up. We've done a couple of research projects around this. We started one in 2020, particularly where we did a big research project where we had journalists across the country talk and have one-on-one conversations, kind of like interviews, but they were just informational purposes to really get curious about their audience's perspective of news coverage, specifically with people who said that they were conservative or right leaning. So we had, journalists from all different places talk to hundreds of news consumers across the US and had some really interesting research findings from that in terms of some of those themes I was just talking about, that they felt like not seen and heard in coverage. They felt often like misrepresented, or that the framing, like just that so many of, not even that the story was factually incorrect some often, but just that the framing of it made it feel like it wasn't made by or for people like them. We hear that from lots of communities, like not just from people on the right, also communities of color, immigrant communities, people who tend to be more disenfranchised and well less served in our country. But we heard that with that research project. We did another round of research later on related to pluralism and addressing polarization and really understanding what audiences thought. And from that, we created a couple of resources. One, our anti-polarization checklist, which I neglected to mention in the first question you asked about resources, but I think might be one of the most helpful and used resources that we have, which is essentially a checklist built on these in collaboration with journalists and in collaboration with audiences in the public in terms of the feedback that they gave these journalists of like what sorts of things that they were seeing. And we've trained hundreds of journalists to use this checklist. And essentially what it is just a checklist to help journalists in the reporting and editing process take a pause and really assess the framing and how their coverage might be seen and heard by people across the political spectrum, like really taking kind of an analyzing lens to say like, okay, is something with the headline and the framing. And we did the research that we did really got specific about a few of those things, like looking at headlines, like, okay, what kind of headlines do people prefer? They said that they had felt like headlines were more trustworthy when they were a little bit more neutral and less flashy and didn't use such like verbs that might like jazz up a headline, but maybe made it feel biased. And so from this, we created lots of resources like a headline checklist, a word checklist, like specific words that people across the country said made it feel like a story was polarized. So we have a whole series of words that we continue to add to as we hear from journalists. So that's some of the research we've done around that. I don't know if I did a very concise job of explaining that. It's been a minute since I've had to explain that research project, so apologies.
No, I think that yeah, I was engaged. I was into it. So I think you're good. Um uh I'm curious if I mean, this is kind of a side note, but have any of your projects collaborated with institutes and audiences outside of the US, and where?
Yes, we've focused a lot of our work in the US just because those are like the political system and the media landscape that we understand the most, just being a small team that's all based in the US. But my colleague Lynn Walsh has done a ton of work internationally. She did a lot of work a few years ago with Radio Free Europe. And so she worked with journalists across many different countries, some who had, facing much different media landscapes, and ones where they felt, more hesitant to talk about certain parts of their work and not. And so she has done trainings. I can't speak to all the different countries, but I know a lot of different countries in Europe were represented in those trainings that she did there with Radio for Europe. I know with the AI cohorts that we've been running, there has been some newsrooms from Brazil that we have worked with, Switzerland, and there may be some in Africa from this cohort. I'd have to fact check that. But yes, we do some international work. But again, like most of our work is focused internationally just because, again, like we understand the political and media landscape here much better and we're less experts of that overseas. But there's some projects where it fits really naturally to invite and include journalists and newsrooms from elsewhere. So with the AI work has been really, really interesting, and some of amazing partnerships have come out of that, and just some really innovative newsrooms. The last research project we did, not the current one we're running, But the last one we had, I think, 2 newsrooms from Brazil in different parts of Brazil, and just the work that they were doing was incredible, like a lot of really cool tech solutions around both using AI, but also getting transparent and about the ethics behind their use of AI. So it was interesting.
Can you say how long have you been with
Oh, that's
how long have you been with trusting news?
I have been with the project since 2019, but the project started in 2016. It was we are still only a 3-person team. We collaborate a lot with other organizations and have brought other people on for certain projects. But the core team has been 3. But it started just as a small fellowship project. Our executive director and founder, Joy Mayer, was really seeing this problem of trust in journalism with her work, and she was um, had been a journalist for many decades and then was teaching at Mizzou and then did a fellowship project with RJI to kind of explore this deeper and do some testing with newsrooms. And so I just so happened to work at a Gannett newsroom that agreed to be part of the testing with her. And so I got introduced to some of the strategies and ideas behind trusting news from the very get go, like some of the very first experiments. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. This makes a lot of sense. And then I just kept bumping into Joy and seeing the work over the course of the next few years. And then when I saw that they had an opening, I jumped on it. I was really excited to. I mean, I love working in daily news and I loved working in the community that I live in. I think that that is a really powerful thing. But I also was really seeing the need for big shifts in journalism. And I think it felt really energizing and also just really important to shift from being a daily news to being part of this bigger solution. Like I was just seeing over and over again how our content when I worked in the daily newsroom was not resonating with people in our community, or how there was these gaps and these kind of like we were out here trying to provide a public service, but that was not what the audience in our community was perceiving often. And so there was just a big gap that needed to be bridged. And I feel like that's essentially the bridge that Trusting News has been trying to build over the last decade of us being an organization. And so I just was really inspired by the work and really energized by it. And so joined the team in 2019, very part time, but then slowly my role has built and I've been full time working with them since probably 2021.
Okay. And I was curious, like, what's the most surprising thing that happened to you while working there?
At Trusting News,
Yeah.
a surprising thing. I don't know if I've ever been asked this question. Let me just think about it for a minute.
Like, I'm thinking a moment that tickled you.
No, I like those types of questions. One moment that surprised me, or you could say tickled me, or just felt really energizing and exciting in the work was some of that research I was talking about that we did related to pluralism in 2021, 2022 area. And part of the research project I was heavily involved with was one where we had essentially we're just having journalists go out into their community and have these one-on-one conversations with folks who don't trust their news. And so it was about 10 journalists across the country that we had them do these conversations to really understand, like deeply understand audience perceptions of news. And it was really different. Like in terms of audiences who didn't trust them, it really varied. Some were conservative and right leaning. Some people were really trying to reach indigenous audiences. So working to build trust with like indigenous and tribal folks. Some, were specifically trying to reach women and women of color. So it really varied. Like there was many different types of people who were part of this interview process, but each of those journalists did around 10 or so interviews with people who had low trust in news in their community. And these were like 30-minute to 45-minute conversations, really asking, like, how do they get the news? What sort of gaps do they see in the news? And from that, we had a interview guide that we created for journalists, but from that, we were able to really strengthen that interview guide. It's another resource that we have on our website. And what we found from the research was that just how impactful that side of listening can be. I mean, it's something like listening is a foundation of our work at Trusted News because, I mean, we can't work to solve the problem of trust if we don't understand what the problem is. And to understand that, we have to be in conversation and relationship with our community. But I think this project just really reinforced how powerful that can be because we found that with these journalists just having one conversation with people with low trust in news, our researchers surveyed the folks who were interviewed after the fact, and they found that like before and after, and found that like I think some 86% of people felt like it built trust and goodwill with the journalists after just one conversation. And some of these like were honestly kind of hard interviews. I wasn't sitting in any of them, but I read through a lot of the transcripts, and like there was a lot of vitriol for journalists. Like people were really had a lot of really negative things to say, and the journalists were really gracious and non-defensive in those conversations and just kind of like trying to guide it in a productive way. So I was just surprised to see how positive people felt about that. And then the really surprising statistic was that almost 30% of the people who were interviewed said that they were considering paying for that news source after having just one conversation with the journalist, which I think it just goes to show how much people don't feel seen in the news and how much if they did feel seen and understood and like the journalist took the time to be curious about them, how big of a shift that could make for them. So I think that that was just really powerful, especially as we, in the industry, there's such a problem of revenue and sustainability, especially, I mean, across the globe, but especially in the US. And, newsrooms are shrinking and journalists are just trying to stay in business. Like it was just an amazing signal to say like, hey, like a way to stay in business, a way that people really feel seen and understood is like taking the time to understand them, to hear them out. And then a lot of what our training was after that was like, okay, what can journalists do? How can you like implement that? The things that they said, like what can you do to actually include that in your coverage and shift your coverage based on the feedback that you heard from the audience? So that was one of my, I guess if you say what tickled me, that was like a really powerful and surprising moment of the work I had. I did not think that the results would be that positive. So that was really encouraging.
That is encouraging. I'm wondering, I know you have some projects in the pipeline coming up that you talked about, but if you can imagine like kind of the imagined future of news and media in the next, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, what do you imagine the landscape is going to look like?
I mean, I can be kind of doomsday, I think. I'm too much of a realist sometimes, but my hope and aspiration for the landscape is that it's one that is flourishing more, that there's more collaboration across news organizations, across like states would be amazing for there to be more ecosystem level work of journalists and news organizations working together, more newsrooms working with creator journalists. And then hopefully, like what I would love to see is more news organizations and journalists adopting what we know are our best practices because we know trust is so related. Like you can't stay in business if you don't have trust, right? Like no one is going to read your content or pay for your content or consume your content if they don't trust you. And so I'd love to see more journalists adopting those strategies in a real way. And a lot of times that often takes like real culture change in news organizations and real institutional change of like workflows and how you cover things. And then like to your question before, it would be amazing to see tech companies also prioritizing that and to be rewarding journalists who are doing the good work, are, being thoughtful about accuracy and ethics and transparency and really rewarding those credibility signals. I think that that would just be such a boost for our overall information ecosystem and just for helping people, the public, navigate the news and understand the world around them.
Okay, that's hopeful, and we do like that. But now give me maybe realistic you, doomsday you. What do you fear may be the case?
I mean, I fear that journalists won't change enough. I mean, it's like any institution. It's just really tricky. It's hard to make big change, especially when it can feel risky. And so I think that we see a lot of times that journalists can just be slow to change. And we're already kind of past the point of like, these are things we should have been doing for years now. We really, I think, in my perspective, have taken audience trust for granted for many, many years, especially if you're working at like a large, well-known media institution. And so I fear that we're already past the point and that unless journalists take a real hard shift soon to take this seriously and to really like upend their norms and routines and workflows, that we'll just continue down this path and then it'll just become more confusing to find good information. There'll be less and less credible news outlets and credible journalists being rewarded for the work or getting paid for the work. So less and less people doing it, and that there just will continue to be more chaos and misinformation and spread, which, I think there's a couple examples I could give, I guess, but it's so the misinformation, obviously, as we know, can have such impact and widespread impact. Even just one bad instance of journalism, right, or one maybe like less accurate, credible, and so I can see that continue to happen on a widespread.
I'd love a couple examples.
Well, one I'm thinking of in particular is with kind of what happened in Minneapolis in December before ICE was deployed there was that there was self-described independent journalist and creator Nick Shirley went to Minneapolis and was created a video, essentially what he says claiming to expose the fraud of the daycare fraud happening there and fraud of like using state money incorrectly for to support that. Specifically,
I
a lot
saw
of say that again.
I think I saw that.
Yeah, it was specifically a lot around Somali daycare centers as well. And so, I think he is definitely, especially since then, I would say most people would consider him a right wing YouTuber influence, like definitely with a point of view. But I think last I checked, which it's been a minute, but I think he still self describes as an independent creator. And just that, like a lot of his reporting that he didn't necessarily follow best practices or standards that like a newsroom or like a journalist I know would follow. There and a lot of newspapers of record have tried to confirm or like debunk his reporting and have just like not been able to confirm a lot of the claims that he made. Yeah, it had huge impact. Like he was invited to the White House. Like I think his video on X has had over 140 million views on YouTube. It has millions of views, like just widespread impact of people seeing this and whether they think it's true or not. It changed policy. Like Trump pulled funding from state, like Tim Walz dropped out of the presidential race, like all these things that just kind of snowballed from that. And some people have said that was connected to some of why there was such heavy ICE deployment. I don't know if that's actually true, but right, there's all these like potential snowball effects that happen. And obviously that was like a very popular, like that 140 million views is insane. That's like an incredibly worldwide viral content. So it's not just like a small instance. That was a pretty big one. But just seeing that like, how much impact that had in communities and just how it's absolutely fair that most people watching wouldn't understand like what makes that different from kind of what typical best practices and reporting best practices for journalists are, or like how those differ, right? Because in the video he does like go to these places, he's like knocking on doors, right? It seems very like raw and authentic, like we were talking about before. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that people might not understand some of the nuances of like why that's different than how probably journalists operating with a lot of ethics and care would probably have approached that reporting differently. So yeah, that's one example.
That's actually a great example because when I remember seeing it come up in my social media feed. And I remember I was like, wow, my initial reaction was, wow, this guy is like in there. Like, he's not afraid to be in the field and he's sharing this with the world. And then as I started watching the video, I started having questions also. So I was happy to have some of this back and forth and conversation around it where some other outlets were talking about kind of, or fact checking it perhaps.
Hmm.
Well,
Yeah, like
and obviously, oh, go ahead.
well, yeah, just like a lot of reporting best practices, I'd say were ignored. But then again, that like really appealed to people because it did. It felt like man on the street. It felt very authentic. It felt very like I'm just out here doing the news and like I'm just like there's like no wall between us. Like you're picking you along. And I think that is something people really, really value from creators, which it can be a really, really powerful tool. But then when people don't understand like why why that isn't good ethical accurate reporting, right? And it
Right.
makes sense that people don't. And so that's why it's like that education around it and helping people understand the differences is just really important.
Yeah. And at least ask questions and look further after maybe you enjoy the video and then dot 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 I guess would be, do something else would be
Yeah.
preferred. Interest. We're almost coming to an end here. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you would like to add, and or a fun fact to add in that I didn't ask you about or you wanted to talk about? Because I'm happy to touch on anything.
Anything. Most of my fun facts about trust are not that fun. Like trust is very low, the lowest it's ever been, at least in the U.S. Yeah, so it's just so I mean, and that everyone knows, like, there's been such a shift from when I started in trusting news to where I am, like, to today, where, over the course of almost 7 years now, like, I feel like there was more having to convince journalists, even in 2019, that, like, trust was the most important. Like, we just needed to everyone needs to focus on this, to where now I feel like that is so well known and like, most people believe that, but then the action has to come with that as well, and so it is just so, so important. I know people know that, but thanks for taking the time to highlight that today.
Well, no, thank you for joining me today. I'm going to anything we talked about, I'll add into the show notes so people can play along and use your trust kits and everything else. If something stood out or you think we missed something, we do want to hear from you. So please let us know. We'll log updates and corrections in the show notes. And if this episode added something to your thinking, please consider subscribing and passing it along to somebody else. Till we meet again, Molly.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks for your time. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.